Oh, gotta put my microphone on. Well, good evening, everybody. Seemed like today was a little warmer than it was a couple of days ago. So maybe we're not too deep in the fall, or maybe it's not that close, at least in terms of the weather. It seemed like it was about 80 today, so that's pretty good. Well, let me welcome everybody officially, those of you who are here in the sanctuary and those of you who are tuned in to us online. Welcome to this time of Bible study as we look at the saga, the story, the life of David, Israel's greatest king and the ancestor of Jesus, and the man that had such a dramatic, fascinating life. So I want to recap for a minute here, and because we kind of left it a cliffhanger last week. So for a couple of weeks we talked about this cat and mouse game between David and King Saul, where Saul had become so insanely jealous of David's popularity that he decided he had to kill him. And David's on the run, and David is best friends with Saul's son, Jonathan. And David has several opportunities to actually kill Saul, but he doesn't take any of those opportunities because he honors the fact that Saul is the rightful king. And he is not a rebel, and he's not trying to usurp Saul. So we have this cat and mouse game, and David does several things to avoid Saul. At one time he feigns madness and stays with the Philistines. Another time he feigns that he's gone to work with the Philistines when he's really double-crossing them. He uses a lot of tricks. He's got 600 men traveling with him. And so we've had all this, a couple of weeks of cat and mouse. And then, of course, we finally came to the end of 1 Samuel, and we find out that Saul and his son Jonathan are killed in battle against the Philistines. David mourns that. He mourns the death of the king. He mourns the death of his best friend Jonathan. But in light of that, David is made king of the tribe of Judah, which is David's home tribe. David is of the tribe of Judah. And so David is made king just of that tribe. But Saul had another son, one son that survived, and that is his son Ishbosheth. And so Ishbosheth becomes the king of Israel, the northern tribes, really orchestrated by this fellow named Abner, who was Saul's general, Saul's leader and military leader. And it is Abner who sort of guides Ishbosheth into this role as the new king. But you can tell Abner is the strong personality and Ishbosheth is not a very strong personality. And so this sets up a hostility between the northern tribes and then the tribe of Judah, which is the largest of the 12 tribes. And there is hostility and there's even warfare between the northern tribes and the tribe of Judah. And we read about the incident where Abner, who is the general who served, was loyal to Saul, now serving Ishbosheth, he actually kills one of David's men, David's nephew, Asahel. And that is significant because David's nephew, Asahel, has two brothers, one of whom is Joab. And Joab is not only David's nephew, he is David's general. So we have this situation. David has a general, Joab, and Ishbosheth of the family of the line, the legacy of Saul. Ishbosheth has this general, Abner. And so we set up this dynamic between not only Ishbosheth and David, but between these two generals, Abner and Joab. Well, Abner is a man who has ambition beyond being second in command. Abner sleeps with one of Saul's old harem girls, one of his concubines, which is often a sign that he is trying to take the place of the old king. Ishbosheth knows that is something that is inappropriate and something that could be perceived as a political movement against him. So Abner and Ishbosheth get into an argument over this woman that Abner slept with, and Abner says, well, I'm leaving you, and I'm going to cross over and become on the side of David now. So Abner makes overtures to David, basically saying, I want to come over to your side, I want to work with you, and I will help you to get control of all the tribes and be king over a united kingdom. So Abner makes these overtures to David, and David is receptive to that, and it ends up with them striking a deal that Abner says, I will help you get control over the northern tribes, and you can therefore be the king over the unified Israel. So they make that deal, and that's where we left it, with Abner making a deal with David to come over to his side and be one of his main generals and one of his main men. And that's where we ended with 2 Samuel 3. We ended at verse 21. Well, what happens next is throws as a fly in the ointment, because now we see, okay, so David and Abner have, they've shaken hands. Abner says, I'm going to go make the arrangements, and you'll be the king over the whole thing here before you know it. And he takes off, and just as he takes off, Joab, which is, remember, David's nephew and his general, shows up. So now, 2 Samuel 3, verse 22. Just then, David's men and Joab returned from a raid and brought with them a great deal of plunder. But Abner was no longer with David in Hebron because David had sent him away, and he had gone in peace. When Joab and all the soldiers arrived with him, he was told that Abner, son of Ner, had come to the king, and that the king had sent him away, and that he had gone in peace. So Joab went to the king and said, What have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why'd you let him go? Now he's gone. You know Abner, son of Ner. He came to deceive you and observe your movements and find out everything you're doing. So Joab says to his uncle, David, how could you let the general of the opposing side, how could you let Ishbosheth's general come in here and you didn't kill him, or at least capture him? How could you let him leave alive? Don't you realize that he is a spy? Don't you realize he's coming here to spy on you so that he can go back to Ishbosheth and report? And he says, how could you possibly let him get out of here alive? Now, was Abner's overture to David sincere? Well, it appears that it was, but Joab doesn't buy it. Joab doesn't buy that Abner is sincerely coming over to David's side. He thinks it's all a trick. He thinks that it's a ruse, and he is outraged at David for letting him, quote, get away. And so it says, Joab then left David and sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the well of Sirah. So he sends messengers, hey, come back. But David didn't know it. Now when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into the gateway, as though to speak with him privately. All right, here we go, General Grant, General Lee, here we go. Let's have a little confab here. Let's have a chat. And so Abner thinks, we're going to make a deal. So Abner goes off with Joab. They're going to have a conference of the two leaders. And there, to avenge the blood of his brother Asahel, Joab stabbed him in the stomach, and he died. Because Joab did not forget that Abner had killed his brother. Back several chapters back, when they had this little skirmish, and it started with, how about some of your young men fight some of our young men, and then it turned into not just a scuffle, it turned into a full-blooded battle. And at that point, Abner killed Joab's brother. And that's been simmering now for a long time. That's why Joab doesn't trust Abner. And that's why he says, well, how'd you let him go? And then he sends for him, come on back, we need to finish this deal now that I'm back. And when he gets him back, he says, let's go talk over here. And he kills him to avenge his brother's blood. Well, this kind of throws everything into disarray because he's just made a deal with David to help him unite all the tribes, and now his general has killed him. So verse 28, later when David heard about this, he said, I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner, son of Ner. May his blood fall upon the head of Joab and upon all his father's house. May Joab's house never be without someone who has a running sore or leprosy or who leans on a crutch or who falls by the sword or who lacks food. So David's response about his nephew who now killed Abner, he says, I am innocent of this. I knew nothing about this. I had nothing to do with this murder. That's on Joab. That's not on me. And he then curses Joab and says, may his house, may they have all these problems, leprosy, running sores, cripple, starvation. He puts all these curses on Joab. And then, just in case we forgot, the author says, Joab and his brother Abishai murdered Abner because he'd killed their brother Asahel in the battle at Gibeon, just in case we'd forgotten about that. So, reminds us, this is why he killed him. So David said to Joab and all the people with him, tear your clothes, put on sackcloth, and walk in mourning in front of Abner. So David now sees the political problem with this. How could this be perceived? He's like, if it's perceived that I engineered the murder of one of the great generals of the northern tribes, then there's no way that those northern tribes are going to agree to unite under my leadership. So he tells Joab, who killed Abner, tear your clothes and put on sackcloth, which, remember, that's a Jewish way of mourning. The Jews, when somebody in the family is killed or it dies or there's some other tragedy, you mourn, you tear your clothing, you put on sackcloth. Sometimes they put ashes on their head, other ways to show they are in mourning. So he tells Joab, you're going to mourn officially for this man that you killed. You're going to march and walk in the funeral procession to show your penance, to show you are repenting of this deed. And he says, King David himself walked behind the bier, the funeral, the coffin, for lack of a better word. They buried Abner in Hebron, and the king wept aloud at Abner's tomb, and all the people wept also. The king sang this lament for Abner. Should Abner have died as the lawless died? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. You fell as one falls before wicked men. And all the people wept over him again. So this would be analogous basically to, I think, a modern, let's say a foreign ambassador came to the White House. Let's say that the Russian ambassador or the Chinese ambassador came to the White House to confer with the president, and on his way out, one of the president's generals murdered that ambassador. That would be quite an international incident. That would be perhaps something that would be the cause of war. And in David's case, he knows this might ruin his chances of uniting everybody under his leadership in the northern tribes. So he makes a very public show of his mourning for Abner, of his praising Abner, of a funeral for Abner. And it says, verse 35, then they all came and urged David to eat something while it was still day. But David took an oath, saying, may God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if I taste bread or anything else before the sun sets. So David is now fasting because of his mourning for Abner. Now remember, fasting in the Old Testament and fasting in the Middle East sometimes means you don't eat anything until the sun sets. You may, just to divert for a minute, you may know about 1 month out of the year in Islam is called Ramadan. And it's a month of fasting for Muslims. But what that means is they don't eat until after the sun goes down. They don't eat anything during the day. But once the sun goes down, they eat a meal. So that's the fasting during Ramadan. So the fast only lasts until sundown. And so that's why David says, I'm fasting, I'm not going to eat until after the sun goes down. So all the people took note and were pleased. Indeed, everything the king did pleased them. So his mourning, his honoring this fallen general from the northern tribes pleases the people. And again, if you're cynical, you might say, well, is David doing all this for show? Is he doing this purely for political reasons, or is he genuinely grieved at the loss of Abner? We're not really told that, but we know the people are pleased by how David deals with this. And it says, on that day, this is verse 37, on that day the people and all Israel knew that the king had no part in the murder of Abner, son of Ner. He has successfully distanced himself from the murder. Then the king said to his men, do you not realize that a prince and a great man has fallen in Israel this day? And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak. And these sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds. So he doesn't, he doesn't punish Joab with, he doesn't kill Joab, his nephew. He doesn't imprison Joab. Joab remains in David's service, but this is an obvious breach between the two of them. This public distancing between David and Joab. And just a spoiler alert, way down the line when I'll remind us of this in a few weeks, but way down the line when David is on his deathbed, because he's going to say, he's going to bide his time, he's not going to do anything to hurt Joab now. But on his deathbed, he tells Solomon, take care of Joab. In other words, make sure you get rid of him. So that's going to happen way down the line. So, David pleases the people. We go to chapter 4. Now, Ishbosheth, remember, who's still king of the north, the remaining son of Saul, Ishbosheth, son of Saul, heard that Abner had died in Hebron. He lost courage. All Israel became alarmed. Now this young king, Ishbosheth, everybody knew that Abner was the real strength behind him. Now Abner has gone, and people have very little confidence in Ishbosheth. Now it says, now Saul's son, this is Ishbosheth, had two men who were leaders of raiding bands. One was named Baanah, and the other Rechab. They were sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, from the tribe of Benjamin, which is, remember, that's Saul's tribe. Beeroth is considered part of Benjamin because the people of Beeroth fled to Gataim and have lived there as aliens to this day. So this tribe got absorbed into the tribe of Benjamin, which is Saul's tribe. Meanwhile, a little parenthetical comment in verse 4. Jonathan, remember who was killed in battle, Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became crippled, and his name was Mephibosheth. This is somebody who will come into play later on. But when Jonathan, David's best friend, son of Saul, Jonathan had a son, a little boy named Mephibosheth. And he is now also a surviving part of the house of Saul, the son of Jonathan. And he apparently, when they find out that Saul and Jonathan had been killed in battle, and there's lots of hoopla, whoever was taking care of Mephibosheth when he was 5 years old dropped him or did something. He probably broke his feet, broke his ankles, and of course in those days it's not like, well, we'll just go to the ER. There is no ER. There is no orthopedic surgeons. There is none of that. So if you break your ankles or break your legs, you're lame for life. So Mephibosheth is damaged for the rest of his life. They're just telling us that he's this young boy, Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, is going to come into play later on. So keep him in mind. Back to these other two fellows. Now Rechab and Baanah, the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, set out for the house of Ishbosheth, and they arrived there in the heat of the day while he was taking his noonday rest. Excuse me. This is something everybody in the Middle East would do and often still does. Take a siesta. In the heat of the day, you close down shop and you rest, and then you stay up late. And this is true in much of the world still, especially in the climates where they're very hot during the middle of the day. There used to be a song about it's only mad dogs and Englishmen that work in the noonday sun. Everybody else is resting and taking a nap in the heat of the day. So he's taking a rest. They went into the inner part of the house as if to get some wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. So these two men in the court of Ishbosheth decide to kill him. Then Rechab and his brothers slipped away. They've seen the handwriting on the wall. They see that Ishbosheth does not have what it takes to be a king. And they said, well, he's going to crumble. So let's just finish him, and maybe we can turn this into something positive for ourselves. So it says, they had gone into the house while he was lying on his bed in his bedroom. After they stabbed and killed him, they cut off his head. Taking it with them, they traveled all night by the way of the Arabah. They brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, "Here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to take your life. This day the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his offspring." You think, okay, what are they thinking at this point? They're thinking, David is going to go, "Way to go, guys. Thanks for taking care of that guy for me. Thanks for murdering him. Here, let me give you a reward for killing the king that I've been warring with." They're thinking, we have just bought ourselves a ticket to Easy Street. We're going to get a big reward and maybe get a big promotion in place in David's court. Now, based on what we've seen David do in the past, is this a smart move? No, this is not a smart move. We've seen this movie before. We've seen how David treats people like this before. So they think, okay, David's going to be very pleased because we brought him the head of Ishbosheth. David answered Rechab and his brother Baanah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of all trouble, when a man told me Saul is dead and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag. That was the reward I gave him for his news." Remember that? The guy who said Saul was dying and I finished him off and here's his crown. Came to David and gave David Saul's crown. And Saul said, "So you're telling me you killed the king, the Lord's anointed?" And he said, "Young men, kill this guy." And they did. He said, "That's what I did when they brought me the news of Saul's death. So what do you think is going to happen to you? That was the reward I gave him for his news." Verse 11, "How much more when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed, should I not now demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you?" Do you really think I'm going to reward you for this? Do you really think that after you go and kill an innocent man in his own bed and bring me his head, that I'm going to congratulate you and reward you? David gave the order to his men, and they killed them. They cut off their hands and feet and hung the bodies by the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in Abner's tomb at Hebron. Now notice the difference here. When when the other fella came in and brought David the crown of Saul, he said, "How dare you kill the king? How dare you kill the Lord's anointed?" You know, he was the rightful king. How dare you kill the Lord's anointed? He doesn't use that term to talk about Ishbosheth. He doesn't call him anointed. He doesn't say anything about him being chosen by God or anointed by God. He just said he's an innocent man. You know, you've killed an innocent man in his own bed, not in battle, not in an honorable way, and so, you know, you're dead. And he has his men kill them. But now, even though he had not caused the death of Ishbosheth, now the field is open. You know, there's no more sons of Saul. There's this one grandson, a 5-year-old grandson, but there's no more sons of Saul. And now the idea that even though Abner is no longer around to broker the deal, the idea of David now becoming king, not just of Judah, but of the whole kingdom, starts to become much more likely. And that's what happens in chapter 5. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We're your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler." I mean, remember, they're saying, you know, when we were fighting those Philistines, you were always the best leader and warrior. When the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a compact with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. So here is finally the fulfillment of what happened way back when David is a little boy in Bethlehem, and Samuel came and said, "This is the one, the youngest brother, he is the one that is going to be the king of Israel." After all of that, finally now that comes to pass. Now David is the king over all of Israel. He is the king over the 12 tribes. He has been anointed and chosen by the people to be the one king. And as the author says, he's 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. He reigned over Judah for 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned over all of Israel and Judah for 33 years. So the first 7 years just over Judah, the next 33 over the entire, all of Israel, all of the tribes. Now, we may have not ever thought about this at this point, but Jerusalem at this point is not a part of Israel. The city of Jerusalem is not part of Israel at this point. But David sets his sights on the city of Jerusalem to be a city that he wants to conquer. This is how he does it in chapter 5, starting at verse 6. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who live there. So Jerusalem is already a city, but it's occupied by the Jebusites. It is a city that is located basically between the tribe of Judah in the south and the northern tribes. Jerusalem is a city that sits kind of in between Judah and the northern tribes. So David has his eye on this city as the ideal place to build a capital city that could be the capital city for all the tribes. So he set his sights on the city of Jerusalem, which is already a walled city on a hill. We call the hill Zion because it is a city on a hill. So therefore, a city on a hill is a city that is that is a good place to defend. Because if you're invading a city, the people who are the archers on the wall are going to be shooting down at you. So that's why it's so hard to conquer a high city. So it says, the Jebusites said to David, "You won't get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off," which is a way of saying, this city is so well fortified, even blind men and lame men could defend this city just because of our position, because of where it's located, because we're up on a hill. And all we have to do is throw down rocks and shoot arrows and do all this stuff, and we can defend the city. Anybody, a bunch of kids could defend this city. You'll never conquer us. They thought, David cannot get in here. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, the city of David. So they said it can't be done, and so David did it. And this, again, is a strategic move, because instead of picking a city in Judah to be the capital, instead of picking a city in the north to be the capital, he conquers a city in between that no tribe has been a part of, and makes it his capital city. The analogy would be Washington, D.C. What state shall we put the capital of America in? Should we put it in Virginia? Shall we put it in New York? Shall we put it, No. They created a district to put the capital in that didn't belong to any state, so that no state could say, we have the capital of the country in our state. They created the District of Columbia just for that purpose. That's what David does. He conquers a city that is not part of any tribe to be the capital of the country. So it says, on that day, verse 8, David said, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those, quote, lame and blind who were David's enemy. That's why they say, the lame and the blind will not enter the palace. David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the City of David. He built up the area around it from the supporting terraces inward, and he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. So he has now positioned himself in this walled city to have a position of power. And his reputation starts to grow. So much so that in verse 11, Hiram, the king of Tyre, sent messengers to David along with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. So he has so impressed the neighbors of Tyre and Sidon are coastal cities where they have cedar. They send not only cedar logs, but they send carpenters with them to build him a palace. After he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and more daughters were born to him. These are the names of the children born to him there. And then, I won't necessarily say all of these names, but notice one name tucked away in the middle of that, Solomon. Now, this is just a summary. We haven't got there yet. We haven't gotten to the birth of Solomon yet, but this is the name of the children born to David once he conquered Jerusalem. And the name that jumps out at us is Solomon. So, what was David really good at when he was a young man? Fighting Philistines. From the day he killed Goliath through all those early battles when the women sang, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands, David is a great warrior. So we find out, chapter 5, verse 17, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went up in full force to search for him. But David heard about it and went down to the stronghold. Remember, he'd been living with the Philistines not that long ago, pretending to be on their side, pretending to be a mercenary working for him. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, shall I go attack the Philistines? Will you hand them over to me? And the Lord said, go, I'll surely hand the Philistines over to you. So David went to Baal Perazim, and there he defeated them. And he said, as waters break out, the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me. And the place was called Baal Perazim, which means the Lord has broken out. Baal, or Baal, which we often see, is a word that means Lord. That's why some of those foreign gods have the name Baal in their name. So in this case, they call it, using the term or the word Baal to refer to God. God has broken out. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them off, which probably wasn't too smart, but remember, the Philistines had been this huge threat before. Now they are so utterly defeated, they don't even take their gods or their idols with them. Then once more the Philistines came up and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, and he answered, "Don't go straight up. Circle around behind them and attack them in front of the balsam trees. As soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, move quickly. That'll mean the Lord has gone out in front of you to strike the Philistine army." David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gezer. Now, what this means is finally, the Philistine threat is finally done. This is going to be the last we hear of the Philistines for a long time. You know, the Philistines had continued to raid Israel and for years and years and years. Finally, after this, David has grown so powerful that the Philistines finally give up and go back to their own land, and they stop harassing the Israelites. And so this brings an era of peace. David finally is able to get rid of the Philistine menace with these two battles. And once he has finally dealt now with the Philistines, it is going to be a time for consolidation of power and celebration. So, the next thing that's going to happen is the Ark of the Covenant. That's what's going to happen now in chapter 6. It says in chapter 6, David again brought together out of Israel chosen men, 30,000 in all. He and all of his men set out from Baalah of Judah to bring up from there the Ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim that are on the ark. Now remember, this goes back 400 years. Remember that Moses, they come out of Egypt. They come into the desert. They build the tabernacle. The tabernacle is the portable sanctuary that they would set up. It was a series of screens and poles. And as Israel traveled through the desert, they would set up this temporary sanctuary called the tabernacle. And it would have a series of courtyards. And in the middle of that courtyard, the middle portion was the holy place, the Holy of Holies. And in the middle of that was this box, the Ark of the Covenant. And I always say, if you've ever seen the movie Indiana Jones, and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know what the Ark of the Covenant looked like approximately. It was about 6 feet long, about 3 feet wide, 3 feet deep. So it looked, it was just a long box. It was carried on poles, and on the lid were two angels facing each other with their wings spread out. And that lid is often referred to in the Bible as the mercy seat. And it's a lid, and inside the Ark of the Covenant are things like the tablets of the Ten Commandments, a jar of manna, Moses' staff, and other artifacts that are a part of the Exodus period. And this box, and of course it's encrusted in gold, it's all covered with gold, and these angels on top. And when the priest would go in on the Day of Atonement to offer the sacrifices on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, they would take blood and put it on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant that they sometimes called the mercy seat. And if there was any place that was considered the most holy place there is, it was the space between those two angels on top of the Ark of the Covenant. That was the holiest place, and that's where the blood offering would be given on the Day of Atonement. So this ark has been around for hundreds of years, but it's never had a permanent home. And it's been carted around and moved from place to place. At one time, the Philistines even captured it. And then, when the Philistines captured it, it brought boils and all kinds of horrible plagues on them, and they got rid of it and brought it back to Israel. Anyway, but this Ark of the Covenant has been kind of left all kinds of places ever since the time Israel came into the Promised Land. Now they're going to bring it to the capital city. They're going to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And so that's what David is going to do. So it says, verse 3, 6:3, they set the Ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the Ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. David and the whole house of Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with songs, with harps and lyres and tambourines and sistrums and cymbals. So it's a parade. They're bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem in a big procession. And they're singing and playing instruments and dancing and making this huge celebration. It says, now, when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the Ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act, and God struck him down, and he died there beside the Ark of God. Now, this is kind of a troubling story, to be honest, because you think about it, okay, nobody was allowed to touch the Ark unless you're the high priest. That's why they carried it on poles. You know, even the Levites couldn't touch the Ark. They had to. There was little, things you put poles through these, chain things. These circles of brass on there, and they put a pole through it and carry it on their shoulders. But they could not actually touch the Ark. Nobody could touch the Ark except the high priest. So they put the Ark on a cart. It's pulled by ox. And these guys are walking beside it, and the ox stumbles, and this one guy thinks, oh, it's going to tip over, and without thinking, he reaches out and he touches the Ark, and he drops dead. And, here, as I was reading about this, different ways to understand this, because remember when, not that far back when we met Abigail and her foolish husband Nabal. And when Nabal found out all that had happened and how David was about to come and kill him, it says, he just dropped dead. And we would probably say, well, he probably had a stroke and a heart attack and just dropped dead. He was so fat and stupid, he dropped dead. Well, here, it says, well, God killed him. But remember, the Bible is an account of what happened, and everything is ultimately what God does. One version of commentary I was reading says that when this guy touched the Ark, he probably went, oh no, oh no, I've done the unthinkable. I've done something really, really bad. And he may have, again, had a stroke or a heart attack at that very minute because of the shock and the horror of what did I do? What have I done? And he drops dead, and everybody's like, oh, God killed him. So, we say God killed him. Well, how directly did that happen? Or was this more just his own fear and shock at the moment? But it reminds them that this is a holy piece of furniture, and you don't treat it lightly. And it says that, verse 8, David was angry because of the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day the place is called Perez Uzzah, which means outbreak against Uzzah. And it says, David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, how can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? He wasn't willing to take the ark of the Lord with him to the city of David. He's like, well, maybe I better, this is like, handling nitroglycerin here. Maybe I better not bring this into my place. Instead, he took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. So he kind of leaves the ark outside the city for a while, but the place he leaves it, that house prospers and everything goes great for them. So he's like, well, I guess it's safe to bring it in. So verse 12. King David was told, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has because of the ark. So David went down and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fatted calf. In other words, they'd walk 6 paces, offer a sacrifice. 6 more paces, offer a sacrifice. 6 more paces, offer a sacrifice. The whole way, they're offering sacrifices just every 2 minutes, all the way into the city. David, wearing a linen ephod, basically a robe, danced before the Lord with all of his might, while he and the entire house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts and sounds of trumpets. So, when it says David is dancing, he's not like, just doing the twist here. I mean, he's leaping and jumping and, he's giving it everything he's got as he's dancing on the way into town. And that's important because of what we read next. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, remember her? David's wife, Saul's daughter, that got taken away from David and married to another man. And then when David gets power back, remember he says to Ishbosheth, basically, you better give me back my wife. And they sent her back to him and took her away from the second husband and gave her back to David because David didn't want a daughter of Saul out there causing a possible problem or rebellion. So Michal, daughter of Saul, is now back with David, one of his wives. It says, when Michal, daughter of Saul, watching from a window, and when she saw David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. Why? Well, we're going to see why in a minute. Michal, watching David dance before the ark, despises her husband David. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and the fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. He gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women, and all the people went to their homes. So they have a huge party. David gives every single person food. Again, always a good thing if you're the king or the ruler to give everybody a gift and make them happy, send them home happy. They have this giant party. Everybody's happy. Everybody's happy. No, not everybody's happy. David's wife isn't happy. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, disrobing in the sight of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. So, remember, David is wearing a robe. David is wildly dancing. You know what did not exist in the ancient world? Underwear. So, when David was dancing frantically, he apparently was showing things to the crowd. And this makes Michal, his wife, disgusted with him. And she says, disrobing in sight of the slave girls like a vulgar fellow. In other words, you are flashing the crowd, David. You're the king and you're flashing the crowd. She's like, what a distinguished little show that was. Of course, dripping with sarcasm. David says, it was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this. I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor. Here's a principle that David says is that when you are worshiping, you can either worry about worshiping God or you can worry about your own dignity. And he says, I will be even more undignified in worship. Because, so some old preacher whose name I can't recall, but one of the old 18th century preachers said something like, you can't elevate yourself and worship God at the same time. Like, well, I'm going to worship God, but I got to maintain my own prestige and my own dignity and make sure I don't look silly. David is saying, when I'm worshiping God, I'm not worried about anything other than that. And I would be even more undignified in the midst of worship. And so of course, he reminds her that says, by the way, remember, I'm the king instead of your father, because God chose me instead of your dad. And then we're given this little note here. Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. David probably did not visit her bedchamber anymore after that little incident. And which is in some ways a shame, because you'd say, well, a daughter or a child born to David and the daughter of Saul would have the benefit of being, from both lines. A child born to David and Michal would be of the line of David and the line of Saul. And it would neatly say, oh, look, both of these lines have now combined, and the crown prince is a son of David, but his mother was a daughter of Saul, and it neatly puts the two lineages together. But that is not to be. So no descendant of Saul is going to have any part of the kingdom going forward, because Michal is not going to bear David any children. So chapter 7 is probably, of all the chapters, maybe the most, the real key in some ways of this 2 Samuel. So think about what David has done. He's become king of Judah. Then he's become king of the united kingdom, the united tribes. He's defeated the Philistines. He's conquered the city of Jerusalem and made it his capital. He's brought the Ark of the Covenant and placed it in the capital. He's riding high here. He's got a palace built by craftsmen from Tyre, a house of cedar. So everything is going up, 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 up for David. And so here we come to chapter 7. After the king was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all of his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am living in a palace of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." I'm living in this nice house, and the Ark of the Covenant, is still in a tent. We're still worshiping God in a tent. And so Nathan says, whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it. The Lord's with you. In other words, what David is going to do, well, I'm going to build a temple. I'm going to build a permanent temple for God. Here in Jerusalem, I'm going to build a place of worship for the whole nation. And Nathan, the prophet, when he hears that, God's with you, do whatever you think. That sounds good. That sounds good. It says, Nathan replied to the king, do whatever you think. But that night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, "Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I haven't dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites out of Egypt to this day. I've been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I've moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of the rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord God Almighty says. I took you from the pasture and from following the flock to be ruler over my people Israel. I've been with you wherever you've gone, and I've cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I'll make your name great, like the names of the greatest men of the earth. I'll provide a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so they will no longer have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did at the beginning and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I'll give you rest from all of your enemies. So he's like, did I ask for a temple? And then here is really the key verse. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I'll raise up from your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I'll establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now here's where we're fortunate that Hebrew and English are the same in this way. In English, the word house has a double meaning, and so does the word in Hebrew. Think about the word house. We call this the house of God, a house of worship. We also use the word house, at least maybe not so much in America, but in English, as in England, we talk about the Queen of England. Well, where's the Queen? What about the Queen of England? She's of the House of Windsor. She is of the House of Windsor. We use the word house there to mean dynasty. Okay? As in the house of, the ruling house, the house of Tudor, the house of Windsor, the house of whatever. It's the same way in Hebrew. And so this verse uses a play on words of the Hebrew word for house. God says to David, David, you're not going to build me a house. I'm going to build you a house. You're not going to build me a temple. I'm going to build you a dynasty. But the word that is used in both is the same word, just like we use the word house. So God says, David, you won't build me a house. I'm going to build you a house. I will build your dynasty. I will build the house of David. And your son will be the one to build a temple for me. Now you might say, why is it that David is not allowed to do that? Well, it doesn't say here, although, the book of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, often repeats the same stories as 1st and 2nd Samuel. If you ever read through the Bible and you read through 1st and 2nd Kings, you read through 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and then you turn the page and you go through 1st and 2nd Chronicles. 1st and 2nd Chronicles are often the very same stories that you've just read, just from a different source. Just like, you read Matthew and then you go, here at Mark, it's some of the same stories. Turn over to Luke, some of the same stories. Well, same way with Chronicles. Chronicles is some of the same stories that you've already read in Samuel and Kings. And in the Chronicles version of the story, it mentions the reason, or at least one of the reasons, why David is not allowed to be the one to build the temple. David's hands are too covered in blood. David is a man of war. And the idea is his son is going to be a man of peace. Solomon's reign will be a reign of peace, and Solomon is the one who will build the temple. But here the important thing is what's often called the Davidic covenant. We have these covenants all through the Old Testament, the Davidic covenant, because we have the covenant, the covenant that's made after the great flood. God says, I'll put my bow in the sky, the rainbow, as a covenant that never again will the earth be flooded. And then he makes a covenant with Abraham. The covenant with Abraham is, your descendants are going to be a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, and the whole earth will be blessed through your descendants. And that covenant is sealed not with a rainbow, but with circumcision is the sign of that covenant. Then there's the Mosaic covenant, the covenant of Moses, which is the 10 Commandments that come down from Mount Sinai. So we've got the covenant that's after Noah, the covenant with Abraham, the covenant with Moses. And now we have the Davidic covenant, which is God saying, your house, your dynasty is going to be an everlasting dynasty. You know, if we pick up, it says in verse 13, talking about David's son, he's the one who will build a house for my name. I'll establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I'll be his father. He'll be my son. When he does wrong, I'll punish him with the rod of men, with floggings inflicted by men. But my love will never be taken away from him as I took it away from Saul when I removed from before you, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. Now, David's descendants do rule over the kingdom and even the divided kingdom eventually for another 400 years. But then, here come the Babylonians, and you say, well, it's over now. The Babylonians conquered Judah in 586 BC, and you say, well, the dynasty of David is done. But we, Christians, would say, no, it's not done, because there is in the prophets that there will come still from the line of David, there will come a new shoot, a new branch, a branch from the house of David will still come. And his throne will be an everlasting throne. The one who comes from the line of David, the one that the Jews come to call the anointed one, the Mashiach, the Messiah, is the one who is great David's greater son. And so those of us who are Christians, when we come to the New Testament, the reason both Matthew and Luke go into such detail to show us the genealogy is to show that Jesus is of the house and line of David. That's why when it's time to register for the census and you have to go to your ancestral home, Joseph goes to Bethlehem, which is where David is from. So, but here is the promise given to David, your throne is an eternal throne. The house, the reign of David is an eternal house. And of course that's fulfilled in Jesus, whose kingdom is forever. Just like in Handel's Messiah, and he shall reign forever and ever. The reign of the Son of David, Jesus, and he's called Son of David, even though, of course, David is his great times a bunch grandfather. But when Jesus comes into Jerusalem on the Passover, on the Sunday that we call Palm Sunday, the people cry out, Hosanna, Son of David. Hosanna, Son of David. That is because the Messiah will be a descendant of David to fulfill this covenant that the line of David's kingdom is an eternal kingdom. So, I'm going to stop there, and we'll continue. And on a high note here with David riding high, and that'll last for a little while before before trouble starts to arise, as it always does eventually. Will arise in David's life. And that'll start in a few chapters with a woman bathing on a roof. And that things will go downhill from there. But we'll pick that up next time. So we'll see you all online and see you guys next week. Let's pray. Lord, go with us now. Watch over us and bless us in your name. We pray. Amen.